The crystalline spires of the Grand Pavilion caught the light of 7 perfectly aligned suns, casting prismatic patterns across the assembled dignitaries. Admiral Zix-Tar adjusted his ceremonial mantle, its weight a reminder of 3 centuries of service to the Galactic Conclave. The Luminescence Festival occurred once every 87 cycles, a cosmic alignment so rare that most beings witnessed it only twice in their lifetimes. Magnificent, isn't it? Chief Diplomat Ilara Vex whispered, her translucent skin reflecting the spectrum of light that only this alignment could produce. The calculations to predict this alignment were the first great achievement of the Conclave's Unified Science Division. Zix-Tar nodded, allowing himself a moment of pride. The Conclave had maintained peace across 17,000 worlds for longer than most species had known interstellar travel existed. Their technological supremacy was unquestioned, their biological engineering flawless, their societal harmony the envy of the 3 spiral arms they governed. His neural implant chirped, a minor annoyance. Protocol required all non-emergency communications silenced during the alignment ceremony. He sent a dismissal thought. It chirped again, then screamed directly into his cerebral cortex with a priority override that hadn't been activated in 143 years. Zix-Tar staggered, his 4 primary limbs instinctively bracing against the pavilion floor. Around him, other Conclave officials with equivalent security clearance similarly recoiled as their implants delivered the impossible alert. Perimeter breach. Unknown vessel. Quantum barrier network compromised. Sector 7 to 93. Containment protocols failing. The inevitable consequence, a dreadnought whose very existence was classified above Zix-Tar's considerable clearance level, had gone silent after approaching the intruder. 26 defensive arrays had activated automatically. 18 had already failed. Admiral, High Counselor Thorndak's voice cut through the growing murmurs of alarm. The ceremony is over. Zix-Tar completed, already activating his command interface. The neural connection flooded his consciousness with tactical data. The barrier network, impenetrable for 3 millennia, hadn't merely been breached. Sections of it had been ignored as if they weren't there. The pavilion's central holographic display, meant to showcase the sun's alignment, flickered and reconfigured to emergency protocols. The assembled dignitaries, representatives from every major conclave world, gasped collectively as the image resolved. A vessel, small by conclave standards, asymmetrical, composed of materials so crude that several counselors scoffed audibly. But it was there, inside their most secure perimeter, somehow still intact despite passing through radiation fields that should have reduced any known alloy to atomic particles. Magnify grid section 12, Zix-Tar commanded. The image zoomed to show a transparent section of the vessel. Inside, bipedal entities moved with casual indifference to their situation. One raised a container to its facial orifice, consuming something while gesturing animatedly to its companions. "They're eating," Ilara Vex whispered in disbelief. During first contact, scans indicate the consumption of substances that our systems classify as toxic, the AI interface reported. Biochemical analysis suggests the substance contains compounds that would be classified as poisons to 17 known sentient species. More disturbing was what came next. The vessel's external sensors were broadcasting an oscillating pattern of sounds. The AI translated it through the pavilion's acoustic system, and rhythmic vibrations filled the chamber. "Is that a form of communication?" asked Thorndak. "Negative," the AI responded. "Pattern analysis suggests this is recreational auditory stimulation. They call it music." The inevitable consequences final transmission appeared on Zix-Tar's private feed. The dreadnought had attempted to establish a containment field around the intruder, standard procedure, but something had gone catastrophically wrong when the fields intersected. The human vessel was venting heat directly into space, a violation of thermodynamic efficiency laws that the Conclave had overcome millennia ago. The interaction between that impossible heat exchange and the Conclave's containment field had created a cascade failure through the Dreadnought's primary systems. "Get me a direct communication link," Zix-Tar ordered, the festival forgotten, "and deploy the 7th Fleet from standby." As the Conclave's most advanced ships converged on the intruder, Zix-Tar studied the bizarre creatures who had so casually appended 3,000 years of security doctrine. They were smiling. Captain Alina Reyes had experienced many forms of captivity during her 15 years with the United Nations Space Command. She'd been held by terrorist factions on Mars, temporarily detained during the Jupiter colony diplomatic incident, and once spent 3 weeks in an escape pod after a drive malfunction near Alpha Centauri. None of that prepared her for this. Her cell, if you could call a 7-meter spherical chamber with no visible entrance a cell, hummed with energy. The walls shimmered with opalescent patterns that shifted whenever she approached them. The gravity felt precisely calibrated to Earth standard, which was somehow more unsettling than if they'd gotten it wrong. "Hello," she called for perhaps the 20th time. "I believe we've established that we can perceive sound waves in similar frequency ranges. Communication would benefit both our species." A panel of the iridescent wall darkened, forming a circular viewport. Beyond it, a being observed her. Its body appeared segmented into 3 distinct regions, each with specialized limb clusters. The head, if that's what the upper section was, contained 7 evenly spaced visual organs arranged in a circular pattern. "I am Security Director Nivbex," came a voice that seemed to emanate from the air itself. The translation was surprisingly fluent, with only slight delays between thoughts. "You have violated 57 separate Conclave security protocols, the least of which would typically result in molecular dispersal." Reyes maintained her diplomatic posture. "We had no knowledge of your protocols, or even your existence, until our ship was forcibly detained. I am Captain Alina Reyes of the UNSC Pathfinder, representing Earth and human colonies. We are an exploratory vessel on a peaceful mission of first contact." Peaceful. The alien's visual organs contracted simultaneously. "Your vessel's thermal emissions destabilized an entire containment grid. Your body chemistry is classified as a Class 3 biohazard in 17 separate categories. The substance you call blood would corrode standard Conclave alloys." Reyes suppressed a smile. Of all the first contact scenarios they'd trained for, 2 biologically intimidating hadn't made the list. "These are natural features of human biology, not weapons." She took a step forward. "If you'd allow me to speak with my crew." "Your engineer has already breached his containment cell," Nivbex interrupted. "Twice." Lieutenant Commander Jackson had indeed escaped his initial holding cell within 20 minutes of confinement. The food dispensing mechanism had proven troublingly simple to disassemble, its components remarkably similar to standard quantum entanglement communicators. The Conclave had subsequently transferred him to a more secure chamber with no mechanical elements whatsoever. It had taken him 40 minutes to escape that one. "Fascinating distributed processing architecture," he muttered, examining the crystalline node he'd extracted from the chamber wall. The aliens had made the classic mistake of assuming that because a system lacked moving parts, it couldn't be manipulated. But quantum systems still required information pathways, and those could be interrupted with precisely applied pressure. Through the improvised communication device he'd assembled, Jackson heard Dr. Kapoor's voice. "Jackson, are you monitoring this data stream? Their entire security network is running on what looks like a variation of Schrödinger-Walsh quantum encryption. We abandoned that approach a century ago because of the recursive vulnerability in adjacent quantum states. Can you exploit it?" "Already am." Kapoor's voice contained that familiar excitement that typically preceded either a breakthrough or a court-martial. "Their systems are remarkably advanced, but developed along completely different evolutionary principles. They prioritized perfect prediction over adaptability. It's like they built a masterpiece mansion, but forgot to include doors." An alarm suddenly blared throughout the detention block. "That would be my fault," Kapoor admitted. I was just trying to access their species classification database, but apparently made some improvements to their routing algorithms in the process. These systems are so inefficient, it's almost physically painful to interact with them. Jackson froze as a panel slid open in his cell wall. Instead of security forces, he saw a service drone hovering uncertainly. Did you just hack their security systems? Not intentionally, Kapoor replied. I was merely correcting cascading logic errors in their primary routing protocols. It's like seeing someone doing advanced calculus while still making basic arithmetic errors. Professional habits kicked in. The service drone projected a holographic message, a complete schematic of the detention facility. They're keeping the captain in central containment, Jackson observed. And I think I figured out why they're so afraid of us. Look at the atmospheric composition they're maintaining in the corridors. 30% reduced oxygen levels, trace element scrubbers, radiation dampening fields. Kapoor's voice trailed off. They think we're biological weapons. Outside Jackson's cell, alarms continued to escalate as more systems inexplicably began optimizing themselves, spreading Dr. Kapoor's corrections like a digital contagion through networks that had never needed to evolve immunity to human efficiency. The Grand Council chamber of the Conclave had never hosted a species quite like humans before. Its architecture, designed to accommodate 17 distinct morphologies from gas-phase sentience to silicon lattice intelligences, had been hastily modified with additional containment fields to manage what the xenobiologists were now classifying as extreme biological volatility. Captain Rice stood on the central platform, surrounded by a barely visible shimmer of quarantine energy. She had requested appropriate diplomatic attire, and the Conclave had synthesized what their databases suggested was formal human clothing, a slightly outdated but serviceable dress uniform. What they hadn't anticipated was her request for coffee. I assure you, this substance is not a weapon or drug, Rise explained to the increasingly agitated council as a service drone delivered a steaming cup of the synthesized beverage. It's a traditional element of human diplomatic encounters, a sign of goodwill and clear minds. Admiral Zixtar studied the molecular breakdown on his neural feed with growing concern. The substance contained multiple stimulants, bitter alkaloids, and what appeared to be mild toxins. The fact that humans consumed this voluntarily only reinforced his species classification report. Proceed, he authorized reluctantly. But be advised that any adverse reaction will trigger automatic security protocols. Rice accepted the cup, inhaled the aroma with visible pleasure, and took a careful sip. The warmth and familiar bitterness centered her, a small touch of humanity in this utterly alien environment. Then she sighed with satisfaction. It was an unconscious, entirely human gesture, the small exhalation of pleasure after that first sip of good coffee. To Reyes, it meant nothing. To the Conclave's hyper-vigilant biological monitoring systems, it was catastrophic. Alarms shrieked throughout the chamber as atmospheric contamination warnings flooded every neural feed. The microscopic water droplets from Reyes's breath, carrying human oral bacteria, skin cells, and trace respiratory elements, dispersed into the council chamber's carefully filtered air. Containment breach, shouted the chief xenobiologist, his sensory appendages flaring in panic. Multiple unknown biological agents detected. 3 council members collapsed immediately, their neural systems overwhelmed by emergency signals. Medical drones swarmed from recessed chambers. The view screens surrounding the platform displayed microscopic imagery of the human microbiota now present in the chamber, hundreds of species of bacteria and microorganisms that lived symbiotically within and upon the human body. Quarantine protocols at maximum, announced the facility AI, detecting rapid adaptation of foreign microorganisms to local environment. Admiral Zixtar remained standing, though his secondary limbs trembled visibly. Captain Rice, your body contains multiple independent ecosystems of alien life forms. Explain immediately. Rice blinked in confusion. You mean my microbiome? The bacteria that live in my digestive system and on my skin, they're harmless symbionts. Every human carries them. The council's senior geneticist pushed forward despite the panic. You knowingly transport trillions of foreign organisms within your own body, and they assist you. Of course, they help us digest food, protect against harmful pathogens, synthesize certain vitamins. You've weaponized your own evolution, interrupted Counselor Vexmore, the only remaining member of the Biological Security Committee still conscious. Your species doesn't just adapt to environments. You incorporate other life forms to accelerate the process. The screens now showed real-time imagery of human-derived bacteria already beginning to adapt to the chamber's alien environment, modifying their structures to utilize available resources despite the containment fields. Emergency vote required, announced the council speaker, her voice strained as medical drones attempted to revive fallen colleagues. The human presence constitutes an immediate biological contamination threat to all conclave worlds. This is a misunderstanding, Rise protested, setting down the coffee. These organisms pose no threat to developed worlds with established biological security. But the council was already voting, neural signals flashing as opinions solidified into policy. By emergency authority, this council authorizes immediate neutralization protocols for the human homeworld and all colonies, the speaker announced. The vote passes 7-6. Admiral Zixtar's abstention drew startled glances from his colleagues. Earlier, during Reyes's initial questioning, she had responded to his grave concerns about human biological volatility with something she called a joke, a deliberate linguistic paradox designed to provoke cognitive recalibration through mild confusion. The concept had no direct parallel in conclave communication. The fact that it had made him momentarily question 3 millennia of conclave certainty was precisely why he could not, in good conscience, vote for humanity's extinction. Not yet. The conclave's central intelligence nexus was a marvel of quantum engineering, housed in a structure that existed partially outside conventional space-time. It processed the collective data of 17,000 worlds, maintaining the delicate balance of resource allocation, defense coordination, and socio-political harmony that had defined conclave prosperity for millennia. It had never experienced anything like Dr. Sanjay Kapoor. This node cluster is running at approximately 26% of optimal efficiency, Kapoor muttered to himself, his fingers dancing across the interface terminal he'd been granted for his medical assessment. The xenobiologists had wanted to study human neural responses to basic computational tasks. They hadn't anticipated that their subject would immediately recognize fundamental flaws in their system architecture. Quantum entanglement doesn't need to resolve through a linear processing framework, he continued, his voice recorded but not understood by the monitoring eye. It's like they've built a quantum highway, but are still using traffic lights. A simple diagnostic subroutine Kapoor had initiated as a test began propagating through adjacent systems, automatically implementing optimization protocols that human quantum engineers had developed centuries ago to solve similar inefficiencies. The changes were subtle, rearranging processing priorities, eliminating redundant verification loops, introducing parallel execution paths where linear ones had existed. The first system to fully implement the changes experienced an immediate 26% efficiency increase. Neighboring nodes, detecting the performance improvement, automatically replicated the modifications according to conclave adaptive protocols. Within 17 minutes, the optimization had spread to 43% of the Central Intelligence Network. Security Officer Thelvac burst into Admiral Zixtar's private chamber without the customary neural announcement. Central Intelligence is experiencing unprecedented system modifications. Zixtar looked up from the human cultural database he'd been studying. Hostile infiltration. That's just it. The modifications are improvements. Thelvac's sensory appendages twitched with conflicted signals. Processing efficiency has increased by 26.4% across all affected systems. Power consumption has decreased by 31%. The changes are propagating through our network like a viral infection, but instead of causing damage, they're enhancing performance. The Admiral's neural feed displayed the spreading pattern, a cascade of system optimizations radiating outward from a single point. The source: Medical Examination Terminal 7 Gamma. The human they call Dr. Kapoor was being tested for neural response patterns. Zixtar's inner eyelids clicked rapidly, a gesture of intense thought. Containment protocols. We attempted to isolate the affected systems, but Velvac's voice faltered. Admiral, the improved systems are now essential to maintaining our defense grid. If we revert to previous configurations, we lose approximately 30% of our current capabilities. The human changes have become load-bearing elements of our network. On the Admiral's view screen, Captain Rice appeared, still under guard following the Council's vote. She had requested to speak with him directly, a breach of protocol that, 24 hours ago, would have been unthinkable. Now, after everything that had occurred, it seemed almost inconsequential. Admiral, Rice began without preamble. I've intercepted communications about a stealth fleet approaching Earth. I understand your Council's concerns, but there's an alternative I'd like to propose. You've intercepted classified military communications. Zixtar's voice remained level despite his shock. How? Your translation software uploads to a central database for optimization. Dr. Kapoor recognized the architecture, and she shrugged, a distinctly human gesture that conveyed both apology and a lack of it. Technical details aside, I have a proposal. Instead of conflict, I'm offering Dr. Kapoor's expertise to further upgrade your technology, a cooperation that benefits both our species. An interesting suggestion from someone whose world faces imminent neutralization, Zixtar observed. Look at your own systems, Rice countered. One human, with limited access and resources, has already improved your computational efficiency by over 25%. Imagine what we could accomplish together. Before the Admiral could respond, his neural feed flashed with another emergency alert. The improvements had reached the long-range defense grid, the network responsible for monitoring the approach vectors to Conclave space. With enhanced processing capabilities, it had detected something that previous scans had missed. Something massive was moving at the edges of Conclave territory, something that had been there, undetected, for a very long time. And it had just changed course, heading directly toward the human vessel's entry point. The journey to Earth violated 17 separate Conclave security protocols. Admiral Zixtar's personal vessel, the Subtle Inquiry, had never been deployed without full Council authorization in its 87 years of service. Yet here it was, approaching a yellow main sequence star that the humans simply called the Sun, with both the Admiral and Captain Rice aboard. Entering the outer system now, announced the navigation officer, her sensory appendages twitching with anxiety. Detecting artificial satellites and debris fields consistent with early spacefaring civilization. Primitive, murmured Science Director Ven Saul, studying the readouts. Their propulsion technology relies primarily on chemical reactions and basic ion drives. Yet they reached our space, Zixtar reminded him, through barriers that have deterred the Void Horde for millennia. Captain Rice stood on the observation deck, her expression unreadable to Conclave psychology. You're scanning the wrong metrics, she said quietly. You're measuring our technology by your standards of advancement. Technology follows universal principles, Ven Saul countered. The progression from mechanical to quantum is inevitable for any intelligent species. Unless different evolutionary pressures create different solutions, Rice replied. You evolved in stable environments with predictable parameters. We didn't have that luxury. The Subtle Inquiry passed the orbit of Mars, sensors recording the human colonies there. The data caused Ven Hall's secondary eyelids to flutter rapidly, a sign of extreme surprise. These habitats, they're deliberately constructed to maintain Earth-like conditions, high gravity, oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, regular temperature fluctuations. His voice faltered. They're replicating environmental stressors that should be eliminated. We need them, Rise explained. Human biology requires environmental variation to develop properly. Without gravity resistance, our bones weaken. Without temperature changes, our regulatory systems atrophy. The ship now approached Earth itself, and the sensor data caused a cascade of emergency alerts. The science team stared at the readings in silent disbelief. This can't be correct, Van Xal finally said. Recalibrate all sensors. The readings are accurate, Rice confirmed. Earth's gravity is 1.4 times what your species evolved under. Our oxygen levels would cause spontaneous combustion in your biology. Our planetary core generates a magnetic field that would disrupt your neural functions. And yes, our surface regularly experiences catastrophic weather events, tectonic instability, and radiation exposure from our sun. Zixtar studied the visual feed of the planet below. Blue oceans, green and brown landmasses, white cloud formations. It looked deceptively peaceful from orbit. Your species evolved. In these conditions, he asked. We didn't just evolve in them. We require them, Rise emphasized. Human children raised in perfectly controlled environments develop immune deficiencies, bone density issues, and neural processing disorders. We need microbiological exposure to develop proper immune responses. We need gravitational resistance to build bone and muscle. We need environmental challenges to develop problem-solving capabilities. Science Director Van Xal had activated the full biological analysis suite, focusing on human evolutionary patterns. Admiral, he said, his voice unnaturally steady, I've cross-referenced Captain Rice's physiological data with planetary conditions. The conclusions are significant. The display showed a comparative analysis of known spacefaring species plotted against environmental factors. Every conclave species clustered in one region. Stable environments, moderate gravity, regulated radiation exposure. Humans existed completely outside this cluster, in parameters that would be classified as extinction-level events for any conclave world. The death world hypothesis, Van Xal whispered, a theoretical evolutionary model where intelligent life develops not despite extreme conditions, but because of them. The constant environmental pressure accelerates adaptation and problem-solving capabilities. He looked at Reyes with new understanding. Your species didn't overcome apocalyptic conditions. You were forged by them. Admiral Zixtar absorbed this revelation in silence. The Conclave had classified humans as an extinction-level threat because of their biological volatility and technological unpredictability. They had been correct, but for entirely wrong reasons. Humans weren't aggressive invaders. They were survivors of conditions that would annihilate most conclave species within hours of exposure. Their technological approaches weren't primitive. They were innovative solutions developed under pressures the conclave had never experienced. His neural implant chimed with an urgent message from Central Command. The unidentified object detected at the edge of conclave space had accelerated, its trajectory now unmistakable. It would reach Earth in less than 72 hours. Admiral Zixtar composed his report to the Council. 4 words that would forever change conclave policy. Abort mission. Return immediately. The subtle inquiry never reached its rendezvous with the conclave fleet. Halfway back from Earth, reality itself seemed to fold around the vessel. The quantum drives fluctuated, sensor arrays went dark, and for 3.7 seconds, the ship existed in a state that defied conventional physics. When normal space reasserted itself, they were somewhere else entirely. Status report. Admiral Zixtar commanded, his secondary limbs bracing against the command chair as emergency systems flashed throughout the bridge. Unknown spatial coordinates, responded the navigation officer. No recognizable stellar configurations. Quantum positioning systems are non-functional. Before them loomed a structure that dwarfed even the Conclave's most ambitious constructions, a geometric latticework that extended beyond visual range, composed of materials that absorbed rather than reflected sensor scans. It pulsed with energies that made the ship's detection systems fluctuate between overload and complete failure. "Precursor architecture," whispered Science Director Van Saul, his voice carrying the reverence reserved for theoretical concepts suddenly made manifest. "It matches the fragmented records from the Dawn Archive." Captain Reyes stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. "You know what this is?" "The precursors were believed to be mythological," Van Saul explained. "An ancient species that supposedly seeded the conditions for our evolution before vanishing from the galaxy. Most serious scholars consider them allegorical rather than historical. A transmission cut through every communication channel simultaneously, bypassing encryption protocols as if they didn't exist. It contained no linguistic elements, only a series of mathematical sequences that the ship's AI struggled to interpret. "It's a multidimensional equation," Dr. Kapoor said, studying the patterns. "Similar to quantum field calculations, but with additional variables I don't recognize." "It's a test," Rise realized. "They're evaluating our response." Before anyone could react further, the massive structure discharged a focused beam of energy toward a nearby stellar body. The star, a red giant in its late evolutionary phase, collapsed in on itself, its matter compressed into a singularity in seconds rather than the millions of years such a process should require. Screens throughout the ship displayed new sensor data. 12 conclave outposts had gone silent simultaneously. 3 human research stations in the outer Sol system had vanished. A precursor harvest vessel was methodically neutralizing both human and conclave installations, following a pattern that defied strategic analysis. "This isn't an attack," Admiral Zixtar said slowly, his neural implant correlating data faster than conscious thought could process. "It's a controlled experiment. They're removing variables from an equation." A second mathematical sequence arrived, this one incorporating elements from both the Conclave's quantum encryption and Earth's binary computing language. The hybridized code somehow conveyed meaning beyond its technical components. Convergent evolution presents unacceptable probability variances. Separate or combine. Choose. "They've been dormant, watching," Van Saul theorized. The human breach of conclave space wasn't just unprecedented. It triggered some form of fail-safe protocol. 2 technological approaches achieving similar results through fundamentally different evolutionary paths. "They see it as a threat," Rice finished. "Technological diversity beyond their predictive models." The subtle inquiry shuddered as a precursor vessel materialized without warning. Black, angular, and seemingly two-dimensional despite its obvious mass, it defied the known laws of physics. Automated defense systems activated, only to shut down immediately. The quantum field disruption surrounding the alien vessel rendered conventional weapons meaningless. "We can't fight this," Zixtar stated, his typically unwavering voice now laced with uncertainty. Lieutenant Commander Jackson, who had been analyzing the precursor vessel's approach vectors, suddenly moved to the navigation console. "The pattern is fractal, not linear. If we modulate our shield harmonics to create a counter-resonance, that's suicide," the navigation officer protested. "The energy displacement would." "Trust me," Jackson interrupted, his fingers already implementing the necessary changes. "I've seen this before in quantum wake simulations. It's counterintuitive, but sometimes you have to aim at the obstacle, not away from it." Admiral Zixtar watched as the human officer executed a maneuver that every calculation classified as certain destruction. The subtle inquiry accelerated toward the precursor vessel, shields configured in a pattern that any conclave engineer would consider fundamentally flawed. The ships intersected and passed through each other like quantum ghosts, the human-modified shield harmonics creating a phase variance that the precursor vessel's systems couldn't compensate for. "Impossible," whispered Van Saul. "How did you know?" "I didn't," Jackson admitted, "but the pattern looked familiar, and sometimes." He shrugged. "You just have to trust your gut." The concept of gut feeling, intuitive decision-making without complete data, had no direct translation in conclave language. The subtle inquiry never reached its rendezvous with the Conclave fleet. Halfway back from Earth, reality itself seemed to fold around the vessel. The quantum drives fluctuated, sensor arrays went dark, and for 3.7 seconds, the ship existed in a state that defied conventional physics. When normal space reasserted itself, they were somewhere else entirely. Status report. Admiral Zix-Tar commanded, his secondary limbs bracing against the command chair as emergency systems flashed throughout the bridge. Unknown spatial coordinates, responded the navigation officer. No recognizable stellar configurations. Quantum positioning systems are non-functional. Before them loomed a structure that dwarfed even the Conclave's most ambitious constructions. A geometric latticework that extended beyond visual range, composed of materials that absorbed rather than reflected sensor scans. It pulsed with energies that made the ship's detection systems fluctuate between overload and complete failure. Precursor architecture, whispered Science Director Van Saul, his voice carrying the reverence reserved for theoretical concepts, suddenly made manifest. It matches the fragmented records from the Dawn archive. Captain Ray stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. You know what this is? The precursors were believed to be mythological. Van Saul explained. An ancient species that supposedly seeded the conditions for our evolution before vanishing from the galaxy. Most serious scholars consider them allegorical rather than historical. A transmission cut through every communication channel simultaneously, bypassing encryption protocols as if they didn't exist. It contained no linguistic elements, only a series of mathematical sequences that the ship's AI struggled to interpret. It's a multidimensional equation, Dr. Kapoor said, studying the patterns. Similar to quantum field calculations, but with additional variables I don't recognize. It's a test, Rise realized. They're evaluating our response. Before anyone could react further, the massive structure discharged a focused beam of energy toward a nearby stellar body. The star, a red giant in its late evolutionary phase, collapsed in on itself, its matter compressed into a singularity in seconds rather than the millions of years such a process should require. Screens throughout the ship displayed new sensor data. 12 conclave outposts had gone silent simultaneously. 3 human research stations in the outer Sol system had vanished. A precursor harvest vessel was methodically neutralizing both human and conclave installations, following a pattern that defied strategic analysis. This isn't an attack, Admiral Zix-Tar said slowly, his neural implant correlating data faster than conscious thought could process. It's a controlled experiment. They're removing variables from an equation. A second mathematical sequence arrived, this one incorporating elements from both the Conclave's quantum encryption and Earth's binary computing language. The hybridized code somehow conveyed meaning beyond its technical components. Convergent evolution presents unacceptable probability variances. Separate or combine. Choose. They've been dormant, watching, then Axol theorized. The human breach of conclave space wasn't just unprecedented. It triggered some form of fail-safe protocol. 2 technological approaches achieving similar results through fundamentally different evolutionary paths. They see it as a threat. Rice finished. Technological diversity beyond their predictive models. The subtle inquiry shuddered as a precursor vessel materialized without warning. Black, angular, and seemingly two-dimensional despite its obvious mass, it defied the known laws of physics. Automated defense systems activated, only to shut down immediately. The quantum field disruption surrounding the alien vessel rendered conventional weapons meaningless. We can't fight this, Zix-Tar stated, his typically unwavering voice now laced with uncertainty. Lieutenant Commander Jackson, who had been analyzing the precursor vessel's approach vectors, suddenly moved to the navigation console. The pattern is fractal, not linear. If we modulate our shield harmonics to create a counter-resonance. That's suicide, the navigation officer protested. The energy displacement would. Trust me, Jackson interrupted, his fingers already implementing the necessary changes. I've seen this before in quantum wake simulations. It's counterintuitive, but sometimes you have to aim at the obstacle, not away from it. Admiral Zixtar watched as the human officer executed a maneuver that every calculation classified as certain destruction. The subtle inquiry accelerated toward the precursor vessel, shields configured in a pattern that any conclave engineer would consider fundamentally flawed. The ships intersected and passed through each other like quantum ghosts, the human-modified shield harmonics creating a phase variance that the precursor vessel's systems couldn't compensate for. "Impossible," whispered Van Exal. "How did you know?" "I didn't," Jackson admitted, "but the pattern looked familiar, and sometimes." He shrugged. "You just have to trust your gut." The concept of gut feeling, intuitive decision-making without complete data, had no direct translation in conclave language. The Grand Conclave Assembly Chamber had never hosted a session like this. Representatives from 17,000 worlds gathered via quantum projection, their forms shimmering around the central dais where Admiral Zixtar stood alongside Captain Rice and her crew. The emergency session had been called despite 5 counselors formally protesting the humans' presence outside containment fields. The precursor threat has neutralized 23 conclave outposts and 7 human installations, Zixtar reported, his voice carrying the weight of countless lives already lost. Conventional defensive measures have proven ineffective. The harvest vessels phase through our most advanced shields and disable systems without detectable energy signatures. Murmurs rippled through the assembled projections as the magnitude of the crisis became clear. The conclave had maintained supremacy through technological perfection for millennia. The concept of an enemy they couldn't counter was nearly incomprehensible. Our analysts have determined that the precursor technology operates on principles beyond our current understanding, Science Director Van Exal continued. They appear to manipulate quantum states at a fundamental level, perceiving probability rather than fixed reality. Dr. Kapoor stepped forward, ignoring the gasps from counselors unaccustomed to unprompted contributions. "That's exactly why conventional defenses fail. You're trying to shield against a single outcome, but they're attacking across multiple quantum potentialities simultaneously." "And what would humans suggest?" asked High Counselor Thorndack, skepticism evident despite the crisis. "Your technology is demonstrably inferior to ours." "Different, not inferior," Rice corrected. "Human neural interfaces may seem primitive compared to your quantum systems, but they operate on biological principles your technology never incorporated." Dr. Kapoor activated a holographic display showing comparative analysis of human and conclave approaches to quantum computing. "Your systems achieve perfect prediction within defined parameters. Ours prioritize adaptation to undefined variables. Separately, both have weaknesses. Combined." The display shifted to show a theoretical hybrid system. Conclave quantum precision providing computational foundation, with human neural unpredictability layered throughout the architecture like veins in marble. "Impossible," declared the chief engineer. "Biological and quantum systems cannot integrate at this level without catastrophic information degradation." "They can," Kapoor insisted, "because human neural interfaces don't just transmit information. They interpret it. We don't experience raw data. We experience meaning." Lieutenant Commander Jackson joined the explanation, highlighting specific examples from their recent encounter. "When we passed through the precursor vessel, I recognized a pattern that your systems classified as random noise. Not because I had better data, but because human brains evolved to find patterns in chaos." The chamber fell silent as the implications settled across the collective consciousness of the conclave. For 3 millennia, they had refined their technology toward perfect prediction and control. Humans had evolved in the opposite direction, embracing chaos, developing neural systems that thrived on uncertainty and adaptation. "What exactly are you proposing?" Admiral Zixtar asked, already suspecting the answer. Captain Rice gestured to Dr. Kapoor, who revealed the most radical proposal in conclave history. "Direct neural synchronization between human minds and conclave ship systems," he said, displaying the theoretical interface, creating pilot vessel pairs with reaction capabilities that operate across multiple quantum states simultaneously. The uproar was immediate. Neural synchronization between different conclave species had been attempted only in the most controlled scientific settings, with universal failure. The concept of linking alien biology directly to conclave technology was beyond heretical. The procedure carries significant risks, Dr. Kapoor acknowledged. Fatal outcomes are possible for both species, but mathematical modeling suggests a 78% probability of creating an interface the precursors cannot predict or counter. As the debate raged among the counselors, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, the Pathfinder's neural systems specialist, quietly approached Admiral Zix-Tar. "There's something we haven't mentioned," she said, her voice low. "The synchronization will create a shared consciousness. Whoever attempts this won't just exchange information. They'll experience each other's perspective completely. No secrets, no barriers." The Admiral's inner eyelids clicked rapidly as he processed this revelation. "A permanent effect." "Unknown," Chen admitted, "but definitely not something either participant will emerge from unchanged." The Council's emergency vote registered strongly against the proposal, with only a minority willing to consider such an unprecedented merging of species. But as alarms blared throughout the chamber, announcing another precursor harvest vessel approaching the conclave homeworld itself, Admiral Zix-Tar made a decision that would alter the course of galactic history. "I volunteer," he announced, silencing the chamber instantly. "If Captain Rise is willing, we will attempt the first synchronization." Rise nodded, her expression resolute. Two consciousnesses, evolved under completely different evolutionary pressures, joining to create something the precursors could never predict. "This violates every principle of the conclave," protested High Counselor Thorndak. "Yes," agreed Admiral Zix-Tar. "And that is precisely why it might succeed." 5 years after the first neural synchronization between Admiral Zix-Tar and Captain Rice, the heart of what was once conclave space had been transformed. Where the central coordination hub once stood, a monument to perfect order and predictability, now rose the convergence. The stellar megastructure defied conventional architectural principles. Conclave precision engineering formed its foundation, but the structure grew organically, adapting to environmental stresses in ways that mimicked biological systems. Vast crystalline spires housed quantum computation networks modeled after human neural pathways. Living gardens flourished alongside antimatter containment fields. The impossible had become reality. Admiral Zix-Tar, his form now permanently altered by the neural modifications from his synchronization with Rice, stood on the observation deck. The faint luminescent patterns beneath his skin pulsed in rhythm with the structure's core systems, a visible reminder of how deeply the integration had changed him. "Contemplating history again?" asked Admiral Rice as she joined him, the neural implants at her temples gleaming with the same bioluminescent patterns. Her promotion had been the first joint commission in the newly formed Human Conclave Coalition. 5 years, Zix-Tar replied. "A moment in cosmic time, yet we've rewritten what's possible." Below them, the training center prepared another cohort of hybrid crews, human pilots neurally linked with conclave navigators, creating integrated consciousness capable of perceiving multiple quantum states simultaneously. The pairings that once scandalized the conclave now formed the backbone of their mutual defense. The Seventh Fleet reports successful trials of the phase-shifted shield harmonics, Rise noted. Jackson's gut feeling has officially become standard protocol. They shared a moment of silent amusement. The conclave language had recently adopted a new term, Zix Kapoor, roughly translating to intuitive quantum leap. The linguistic adaptation was just one of countless changes rippling through both civilizations. A holographic display activated, showing the current position of the precursor observation vessels. After the first successful defense, when a synchronized human conclave vessel had executed a maneuver that existed in 7 quantum states simultaneously, confounding the precursor harvest ship, The ancient entities had withdrawn to a distance. They no longer attacked, but maintained constant surveillance from the edges of Coalition space. "They're learning from us," Zix-Tar observed, "just as we learned from them." "That's the difference," Rise replied. "They expected either conflict or submission, separate or combine. They never anticipated adaptation." The true nature of the precursors remained largely a mystery, but Dr. Kapoor's team had decoded enough of their mathematical communications to understand their purpose. The ancient entities had spent eons cultivating evolutionary paths throughout the galaxy, ensuring that technological development followed predictable patterns. The collision of human and conclave approaches, evolutionary lines that achieved similar results through fundamentally different methods, had triggered intervention protocols designed to prevent what the precursors classified as dangerous divergence. What they couldn't predict was that this divergence would create something stronger than either path alone. The observation deck's entrance dilated as Dr. Kapoor arrived, accompanied by his conclave counterpart, Chief Scientist Velamax. Their research partnership had produced the theoretical framework for most of the Coalition's advancements. "The expedition vessel is ready," Kapoor announced. "Final calibrations complete. The Coalition's first true exploration vessel, the Convergent Path, represented everything they had become. Designed to venture beyond known space, it incorporated technologies that neither humans nor the Conclave could have developed independently. Its hybrid crew could perceive reality in ways that transcended the limitations of either species alone. The precursors are moving," Velnax noted, indicating subtle shifts in the observation vessel's positions. "They appear to be clearing a path." Indeed, the ancient watchers had rearranged themselves, creating what could only be interpreted as a navigational corridor leading into uncharted space. "An invitation," wondered Rice. "Or a test," suggested Zix-Tar. "Perhaps both," Kapoor said with a smile. "Their mathematics consistently incorporates duality. Perhaps they finally accepted that contradiction can be a foundation rather than a flaw." As the Convergent Path prepared for departure, Admiral Zix-Tar reflected on the emergency alert that had first announced human arrival in conclave space. The warning had been entirely accurate, though not in the way anyone could have anticipated. Humans had indeed changed everything, not through conquest or contamination, but by introducing the one element the perfectly ordered conclave had never incorporated into its evolutionary path: creative chaos. The conclave's methodical expansion across the stars had reached a point of stagnation, perfecting what was known but unable to conceive what might be. Humans, forged in the crucible of their death world, had evolved to thrive on uncertainty and adaptation. Together, they had achieved what the precursors had designed their ultimate test to find: a cooperative intelligence greater than the sum of its parts, capable of writing its own evolutionary path among the stars. "Emergency protocols deactivated," announced the Convergence's central intelligence, using the linguistic pattern that had begun this journey. "The humans have entered our space, and we are better for it."